Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you for this historical moment. Today, the XPRAG Wine Series is in hybrid mode, and Ira and I are in the same room, even though I'm sitting on the opposite end of the desk now. And thanks to some PhD students here who are organizing the so-called Friday Prime series, we were able to have this hybrid session. So thank you to Radim, Daniela, and also Isabella for organizing this. And we're very excited to have Danielle Matthews today as our speaker. So this is the first talk on pragmatic development in this series. And I'll hand it over to Ira for the introduction.
Okay, I don't know where I am, it doesn't matter. Thanks, Danielle, for joining us today. Danielle, who keeps a low profile on the internet, but I did remember that she spent time in France, because I think we met at one of the early XPRAG conferences, and she had spent time in Lyon and in Aupuy, which is not a city not too far. And she, more relevant to tonight's talk, is that she got her PhD in Leipzig with Mike Tomasello, and then also Manchester with Elena Levin. I hope I got that right. And today's title is Pragmatic Development, what it's about and how it gets started in infancy.
Okay, thank you ever so much for the warm invitation. It's so nice to be part of this series. I've really enjoyed the ones that I've been able to come to so far, and it's kind of one of the silver linings of COVID to be able to join things in the evening here. Sorry, I have to do something else to move on the slide. So yeah, if I were still in Lyon, I would be joining you with a nice glass of wine from somewhere just slightly further south and sunnier. But as I am in the north of England, despite it being the evening, I'm having a nice cup of Chateau de South Yorkshire, otherwise known as tea. So yeah, I hope you're enjoying whatever your beverage is this evening. Yeah, so let's talk about pragmatics and pragmatic development. So as far as I can see, the function of language is to be together. And so whether that be to share information like we're doing this evening for a practical purpose, or whether it be like for these two people, perhaps you don't really need to do anything, perhaps they're on holiday, they're looking out at the scene in front of them, and they're just using language to sort of be on the same page and see the world from the same vantage point. And maybe if they don't see things quite the same way, then one person can use language to create some common ground with the other. Obviously, when children come onto the scene, we're not slow to welcome them into this togetherness through language. And at the very beginning, that might look something like this, where the togetherness is literally physical. So there might be sounds and vision, but it's not being used for language. So what we're going to talk about today is how we get from this sort of togetherness, physical togetherness, to the psychological togetherness that we might see here, where the baby and the caregiver are oriented towards some object or event out in the outside world. And the baby can communicate perhaps through babble or gesture, or maybe even beginning with words, and the caregiver can respond and so on, and they can be together through language in that way. So that's going to be the bulk of what we talk about today. So I'll start off with a working definition of pragmatics in the context of child development, and then consider these very early experiences of the newborn and early dyadic interaction, before then considering the transition to the coordination of attention to the outside world and the transition to first words. And that will be a sort of a resume of the first two chapters of this book that I very nearly finished, but seems to be going on forever, on pragmatic development. And then at the end, I'll very briefly consider the next steps towards combining words into sentences, so using information structure, so information packaging, information status, some implicatures, and then building up to the multi-sentential level with extended discourse and narrative, and then using non-literal language like, well, the pinnacle would be, I guess, irony. But that will be very, very brief at the end. And the point of the beginning is that it's like the very same processes are going to come to play again and again as we go up through these levels of language development. So the idea is to kind of set the foundation here. I can't see everybody, so I don't get that kind of feedback that we might have if we were in person. So please do take your sound off and shout out if you need me to, clarify anything, or you want to make a comment, or hope.
Make my own.
Yeah, so if you could put your
Okay, that's okay. Or put it, if somebody wants to put it in the chat, and then is that what you were going to say? Then you could interrupt if somebody could interrupt if there's something in the chat, or of course I'll make sure there's time at the end. So okay, so let's make a start with a working definition of pragmatics in the context of child development. So if we start from something like Nelson's work in the 80s, where she proposed a progression so this would be looking at semantics, where she proposed a progression from reference. So first words might be understood in a very context-bound way. So you might understand, baby might understand that this word is being used in this context, maybe to talk about our dog, but they don't really have a sense yet of what she would call denotation, which is understanding that the word dog can be used to talk about the set of possible reference of the word, or the set of dogs. So that will be a next development, followed by sense, which is understanding how words are used in contrast to other words in the language. So she proposed this developmental progression and proposed that the only way a child can access the language of their community is through use in context. So that's where you start out at this first stage. And that would be pragmatic, right? We're interacting with each other. We're trying to figure out, we sort of have a goal-directed state. We're in a social situation and language is being used in that context. And that's how we first understand it. And then over time, with repeated use with others, it's possible to systemize those aspects of context that are relevant for the use of a given word. And with that, we start building up a semantic system. And an individual child system will reflect that of the people with whom they've spoken or signed. And this in turn will reflect the system of the wider community. So that was kind of a proposal for semantics. And in building on that, and in line with current psycholinguistic and cognitive neuroscience work, I think to define semantics in terms of a developing child system, it would be sensible. This is kind of a wordy definition, but I think it's necessary to define it as those elements of meaning that have been distilled from experience in context. So that's the pragmatic side of things. With repetition to yield more context invariant, stable, well-integrated representations of higher order heteromodal relationships among multiple cognitive sources of information. So this is a picture of the hub and spoke model of semantic cognition, but you could pick your favorite model and put it in there. The basic idea is that we are starting off with some pragmatics, understanding communication and context, and then we're distilling out the semantics. So when we want to define pragmatics in a developmental sense, then our first step was already there before we had the semantics. We were understanding communication in context. But even when we have a semantics, in any instance of use, it has to couple up again with the current context. So we're back to pragmatics. And each use then will indeed even change our semantic conceptual store ever so slightly, or initially create it. But once we have this semantics and we're pretty sure that we're using words, we're pretty sure of how words are used, and we're pretty sure that other people are in on this game with us, then a second stage to pragmatics is possible. The second point here involves adapting to the addressee, including to the fact that the speaker has certain assumptions about the way language is used and the way, and they know that we know that. So the idea is, once we're confident about word use in early development, then we start to be pretty sure that, okay, we have some expectations about how these words should be used, and if they're not used in that way, then we might draw certain inferences. So we could take, for example, Eve Clark's principles of convention and contrast. Once we know, say that this is a pencil, if I have some novel object here and you say, give me the modi, well, I can use those principles to essentially infer that, well, if you'd meant pencil, you would have said pencil, but you didn't, so this must be the modi, that sort of thing. So we can start having, we can start making some inferences based on the fact that we have this common shared language. But of course, these two dimensions of pragmatics are not really separate. They're linked because of our concern to interpret what we conversants are doing when we're speaking. It's just that the first is heavily context-based and the second is more about inferences, given that we share a language. So I hope that sounds about okay. I guess if I had to map that onto other sort of definitions of pragmatics, then that would maybe map to Levinson's sort of AI definition, or I guess the second step in the complete adult system would map onto Mira Ariel's definition of pragmatics as being about inference. But I guess what we're doing is we're saying where the code comes from for children, such that we can make this divide. Although, as I'm making this first point, this divide is never completely clear because of the interplay between the two developmentally. Okay, so I hope that's okay as a working definition of pragmatics in the context of child development. Let's move on to think then about where this all really begins with newborns who, as you know, are immediately socially oriented, especially with respect to emotions. So newborns pay attention to precisely those aspects of the social environment that help them learn to communicate. So faces, voices, biological motion, contingency. And these simple biases plus their basic brain architecture lead to cortical specialization, or that's the argument. That's how we all come to have roughly the same cortical organization. And from a kind of anthropological point of view, people like Sarah Blaffer-Hardy would argue that there's a possible evolutionary advantage to this kind of being tuned in very early to being socially oriented, because we are cooperative breeders. So unlike most other primates and all other great apes, we don't our babies don't hold on to us physically for necessarily that long. So we're willing to hand babies over to other caregivers, other parents, what professionals, whoever. And so the argument is that we need to be in psychological contact with our young and infants who have that ability to remain in psychological contact will have an advantage because they're not always in physical contact. So that's the idea. So I guess while the proposal that newborns are really prepared to learn about communication is fairly widely accepted, what's perhaps given less attention is that caregivers are also really prepared to be tuned in for this learning. So they undergo significant adaptations upon the arrival of an infant. So most obviously biological mothers undergo large endocrinological changes which have an impact on the brain, but also fathers and non-biologically related caregivers show hormonal differences in response to caring for an infant. And so that puts us in a position where we're ready for this dyadic phase of learning very early on. I'll show you an example video of this.
Hello. You got hiccups? Is it just one? You've got hiccups, haven't you? You have got hiccups.
So you can see that this caregiver is replying to hiccups as if they're conversational turns. But what caregivers tend to do, albeit unconsciously, is selectively respond to their infant's most adult-like communication. So when this baby starts to produce more speech-like sounds, this caregiver will start selectively responding to those more, and that will obviously promote learning. And the other thing that caregivers are doing at this early stage is engaging in family routines, be they just day-to-day practical or playful, which the infant can reliably extract a pattern of activity from and increasingly enter into and even initiate themselves. So infants are already in there engaging in turn taking, they're learning that their vocalizations get a response. And by 5 months, if they don't get a response, they'll seek to elicit it by vocalizing even more. And they're learning how sound conveys affect or emotion in language-specific ways. So a lot's going on there, such that we could say that even in this very early stage, we can see the roots of pragmatic development. So very young infants know when someone is with them because that person is in physical contact with them, but also because they produce self-relevant contact, self-relevant eye contact. So these would be sort of psychological contact cues, if you like, eye contact, vocalizations, and contingent behavior. So from 0 to 4 months, we see these communicative cues increasingly being used to signal togetherness, where once we might have just been in physical contact. So I think you could argue on this. I mean, we would need more evidence for this, but I think it's reasonable to propose that very early on here, we already have the basis of both communicative intentions and informative intentions. So the basis of communicative intentions would be just that when I communicate, I'm doing so for you and I seek only recognition or togetherness. And the basis of informative intentions would be this biobehavioral synchrony that we briefly spoke about, where the neonate and the caregiver align both behaviorally, so they're producing communicative acts like cooing and responding, and at the same time, so in temporal synchrony, they're aligned physiologically, so they're having the same hormonal responses and the same sort of heart rate and so on. And what that results in is commonly felt emotions being experienced at the same time as communicative expressions, and this gives meaning to those communicative expressions. So we have expressions about emotion. So that's the idea, that this is grounding communication. But then from this, we need to build so that we can not just enter into dyadic interactions where the caregiver is emoting and the infant's emoting and they're taking turns, but where they're turning towards the outside world and actually able to talk about that. So it's kind of difficult to know when children are able to deliberately communicate with people in order to direct their attention. Obviously, we're not inside their minds, so we can't read what they're intending to do. But often people use gaze coordination or looking to somebody that that the infant might be trying to communicate with as an indicator that they are indeed trying to direct their attention. So the idea would be that if a baby went, da, and looked at somebody, that this gaze coordination, so the coordination of gaze with the vocalization, is an indicator that that vocalization was intended to direct attention, or that would be the inference we draw from that. So in a study of 134 11-month-old babies, we observed that these babies were indeed above chance in coordinating their vocalizations and gestures with gaze to their caregivers. So this suggests that when they're producing vocalizations and gestures, they're intending them for them to have an impact on their audience. And indeed, gaze coordinated acts were more likely to elicit a response from their caregiver, so they're kind of effective. So if you like, at this stage, the infant is already shaping their own learning environment. And alongside other experimental evidence for gestures and vocal communication, this suggests that there is emerging intentional control at 11 months over the use of vocalization and gesture to direct attention. And the question I'm really interested in is this development dependent on experiencing interaction with others? And one important source of evidence here is the development of deaf infants. As you may know, 95% or thereabouts of deaf infants have hearing parents who generally have little experience of deafness. The other 5% have deaf parents, or roughly 5% have deaf parents, some of whom will be fluent sign users, some of whom won't, but all of whom generally will be able more intuitively to communicate with an infant in a shared modality. But for hearing parents, there's very high variability in the way dyads manage to interact communicatively. And this isn't just about the hearing parent, but also the way that the infant learns to communicate. So deaf infants with deaf parents learn to look at their parent more, for example. So they're using, they're looking for communication in a visual modality. But hearing parents sometimes, not always, but often struggle to support joint attention. So let me just show you a video. This is an infant, a little boy who's already got cochlear implants, and his caregivers are communicating with him both with spoken language and with sign language. So he's sort of bimodal, bilingual, but the caregivers are not native signers. So let me just show you this video to give a sense of how joint attention and communication is coordinated. Open the door. Open the door. Yeah. So you could see the caregiver using tactile cues there and speaking and signing at the same time. So what what we've looked at to explore the role of experience in learning to communicate prelinguistically is our infants who are between 12 and 18 months and who have not yet had a cochlear implant, whether or not they're going to go on and have one. And what we saw, this was a study by Kira Kelly for her postdoc, we saw a delay in prelinguistic communicative development, both in the vocal and perhaps surprisingly also in the gestural modality. So let me show you her reasoning for why this might occur. So why would deaf infants be at risk of a prelinguistic delay, both in vocalization, but also in gesture? So the idea here is that hearing parents often intuitively rely on the auditory modality during interaction, not just for speech, but also to use non-linguistic vocal cues, so gasps, in temporal synchrony with that action. So for example, if you wanted to say, "Ooh, what's this?" Even if you take the "what's this" out of it and go, "Ooh," and "ooh," then the idea is that the synchrony of the action and the sound focuses the infant's attention and regulates interaction. And if those gasps and oohs aren't accessible to a deaf infant, then joint attention can break down or not be established in the first place, and that can make it harder for the infant to learn about communication. So that's the rationale. And what Kira did is look at a whole bunch of videos of a relatively small group of infants aged 12 to 18 months who were severely or profoundly deaf in both ears, and whose caregivers were hearing with little prior experience of deafness. And she compared these children to closely matched hearing infants, typically hearing infants who were matched for gender, age in days, and socioeconomic circumstances. And what you can see here is we've counted the median frequency of each of these communicative behaviours: gives, shows, index finger points, and gaze coordinated vocalizations. We know these are important behaviours for predicting later communication. And what you can see is, so the deaf infants are in red and the typically hearing infants in blue. And what you can see is both for the gestures and for the vocalizations, the deaf infants produce fewer prelinguistic behaviours, actually 4 fewer prelinguistic behaviours in 25 minutes of play, which you can imagine, because these behaviours elicit a response from the caregiver, you can imagine this having a cumulative effect on communicative development. And it's quite striking that infants do produce gaze coordinated vocalizations, but they're far fewer. But likewise, there's a striking difference in gesture also. So it seems that lack of access to sound can disrupt interaction and reduce the frequency with which infants engage in intentional triadic prelinguistic communication, and which then has the knock-on effect of there being less opportunity for caregivers to respond in a way that further scaffolds language development. We have done some follow-up studies on this, and it suggests that video-based supports can help in harmony with professional guidance, so it can help families. So if you're interested in that, I can make these videos available. But the take-home point here is that large differences in interaction do result in large differences in prelinguistic communication. So it seems that to make these first steps in actively communicating about the outside world, you do need a fair amount of experience and access to communication. Let's think now about the next transition to first words. So on accounts like those of Liz Bates and Mike Tomasello, those intentionally communicative prelinguistic acts that we just saw, like babbling and babbling with eye contact, and pointing and showing and so on, the idea is that these are the foundation stone for transition to conventional language. And if that's the case, then gaze coordinated vocalizations and gestures, these prelinguistic acts, should predict word use over the second year. There are a whole bunch of theoretical accounts, and empirical studies looking at how gesture, vocalization, social cognitive development like gaze, understanding, and caregiver interaction all predict later communicative development. But one of the problems when kind of testing these theories is that often individual studies will just collect data on one of these things, and we don't know whether they all go together or how they together or uniquely explain the transition to conventional language. So what we wanted to do in this next study that I'll talk about is code naturalistic videos for all of these behaviors. So for vocalization, for gesture, for the infant looking to the caregiver when they're vocalizing or gesturing, and for the caregiver's response. But the problem, as you can see from this slide, when you start to code videos for all of those things and use them to predict the transition to language, conventional language, is that you end up with this combinatorial explosion. Vocalizations can combine with gestures, can combine with eye gaze, can receive a response or not receive a response. And so you end up with a sort of analytical problem. And we worked with Colin Bannard to solve that problem by using multimodal inference to gauge the predictive value of different pre-linguistic behaviors that we've shown here that are hierarchically organized. And we applied this modeling procedure to the naturalistic videos of naturalistic interaction of 58 infants observed at both 11 and 12 months. And then we followed these infants to measure their vocabulary through the second year of life. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit through that modeling procedure and just show you the behaviors that we observe to be very valuable predictors of later vocabulary production. So on this slide, I'll just show you the results of the modeling when we only looked at what infants did. So infants' gestures, their vocalizations, and their coordination or not with gaze to the caregiver. So this was Donlan's PhD work. He's now a postdoc at UCL. And what he found was that the best predictor when you just look at what the infant does is the amount that babies at 11 and 12 months produce these gaze coordinated vocalizations. So that's when the baby looks the caregiver and vocalizes like da or ah. And what he found, so this is a plot showing you the effect size and the direction of effect. So what he found was that babies who produced gaze coordinated vocalizations with a frequency 1 standard deviation above the mean, so babies who did this a lot, they produced about 20 extra words at 19 months compared to the average baby. Now, babies don't produce that many words at 18, 19 months, 1.5. So this is quite a substantial effect. And we found that, so this was the most valuable predictor, but another valuable positive predictor was show gestures. The more babies show things to their caregivers at 11 and 12 months, the bigger their vocabulary is likely to be. But there were other behaviors that were negative predictors. So the more babies vocalized without a consonant, or the more babies used an open-handed hand position when they were pointing as opposed to an index finger point, the more they did that, the smaller their vocabulary was likely to be at 18 or 19 months. So these were kind of markers of risk of delay, if you like. So those were the results when we just modeled everything on the basis of infant behaviors. But what we then did is added caregiver responses into the model space. And then actually the picture was simplified quite a lot. And what we saw was 3 predictors were really very valuable in predicting 19-month vocabulary. And they were, this is a complex behavior here. So this is gaze coordinated and responded to vocalization. So this is when the baby vocalizes, they look to their caregiver and the caregiver responds in a timely fashion. This was our best ever predictor. And the more babies experience that at 11 to 12 months, the bigger their vocabulary is at 19 months. So sort of almost 30 words bigger than the average vocabulary if they had experienced that with a frequency 1 standard deviation above the mean. Other valuable predictors were any vocalization that was responded to. So it didn't seem to matter so much whether it had a consonant in, so whether it was more speech-like or not. And also any caregiver contingent talk. So this is, regardless of what the infant was doing, is the caregiver just talking about what the infant is attending to? even if the infant isn't communicating. And we found that actually that was a very good predictor of later vocabulary. And this is interesting from a clinical point of view, because what this suggests is even if the baby isn't communicating yet, by giving a running monologue of what their baby is attending to, you're likely to be supporting later vocabulary development and this transition from pre-linguistic to conventional communication. So the take-home message from that study is that intentional vocalizations that were responded to by a caregiver were the best predictors of subsequent word use. And so it does indeed look like practice with pre-linguistic intentional communication, as those theories proposed, does facilitate the leap to symbol use. And it suggests that learning is optimized when caregivers respond specifically to infants' intentionally communicative vocalizations with appropriate language and also to their gestures. So I just want to give you a quick clip here of a baby engaged in a vocalization where she gaze checks her caregiver and the caregiver responds in a timely fashion, as this is what we found really seems to propel the transition from pre-linguistic to linguistic communication.
That's right, yeah. You can go to be afraid if you want.
So the baby vocalized, she looked to her mum and the mum said, yeah, you can colour this in red if you want. That video was made in Scotland, so it's a Scottish accent. Okay, so that evidence of intentional communication predicting language from an individual differences study there, but we also have additional evidence from this role of experience from true experiments and natural experiments. So just to give you an example of a true experiment, we ran a randomized control trial where we said to parents, you know, it looks like this way of talking to children can really support their language development. We'd like to find out if that is true. Do you think you could try doing this a little bit more for 10 minutes each day? And we'll see if this helps language development. And then we had a control condition who we asked to spend 10 minutes each day getting a good routine for dental health in place for their baby. And what we found was that for children from lower socioeconomic circumstances, their parents were able to increase the amount of contingent talk they engaged in, and that did have a causal effect on their language development at 15 and 18 months. So it does seem to this does seem to be a causal factor. Okay, so we've talked about early interaction, the transition to the outside world, and the transition to first words. And that's been kind of a resume of the first two chapters of this book that I've been working on, and that I'd like to argue kind of sets the foundation for later pragmatic development. Because what's going on here, when we talked about the definition of pragmatics and semantics, we talked about very early interaction in context, allowing the distillation of semantics or a lexicon, which when infants become confident in using this permits more advanced pragmatic inferences of the type that we typically think about in perhaps the adult literature. But the argument is that this confidence that we get with words allows inferences at the word level, but then this continues to this developmental pattern continues to play out at the later steps with sentences and multi-sentential structures. So I wanted to finish up by very briefly sketching out how that might happen. So we talked about, this is the chapter plan for the book, and I'll just talk about the first 6 chapters as kind of chapters 2 to 6 being a developmental trajectory. So we talked about pre-linguistic communication, and that, as we saw, once infants are confident with their pre-linguistic communication, the more practice they've had at it and the more responses they get from their caregiver, the more words they use in the second year of life. And then I would argue that the more confidence infants have in their words and the more practice they have in using those and in getting responses and in using them interaction, the more they're able to make inferences based on Eve Clark's principles of convention and contrast. So the idea here is that if you're very confident in word use, if I present you with a pen and a novel object and I say, oh, give me the Modi, because you're confident that this is a pen, you can now make the inference that this must be a Modi. And indeed, the literature suggests that infants who are more confident in the word pen are more likely to make that inference, and infants who have a larger vocabulary generally are more likely to be able to deploy these principles of convention and contrast. So basically, what's happening here is we've gone up to the next level. We're now using words, but we need to spend a bit of time becoming confident with how words are used so that we can use these principles of convention and contrast to learn even more words. And once we've got about 200 words in the vocabulary, then you see infants starting to combine words into mini sentences. And then the idea is the whole process starts again. We start using sentences. Early on, we're a bit shaky on it, but eventually we're able to tune into what functions can be performed with multi-word utterances. So if we're learning an Indo-European language, then kind of the syntax is likely to be taken up with marking semantic relations like agent-patient relations, but we might tune into the fact that we can also use these sentences to mark information packaging and information status. So we're learning about information structure, which might be carried by the prosody, for example, or it might be carried in it maybe in an East Asian language differently with word order. So children are having to, again, take some time to be confident with their multi-word utterances to start figuring out how these pragmatic relations are marked in their language such that they can confidently use it. And that takes a fair amount of time. Although you do see from 2 years of age some really interesting developments where 2-year-olds are tuning into how to use sentential subjects, so a syntactic device, at the same time as they're starting to be able to express topic and comment. So they're learning that they have to express the topic if it's obligatory in their language before they launch in with the comments. So this all seems to be coming together around 2 years of age, and then it takes a bit longer to get a handle on information status, which is, so if we think of information packaging as horizontal, we're thinking about linking the topic to the comment. Information status is like the vertical, where you're selecting an appropriate referring expression given the accessibility of the reference. And that seems to take that bit longer, where infants have to have quite a lot of time experiencing interaction and breakdown before they, and repair before they figure that element of sentences out. This all seems to be driven by understanding the question under discussion, which also allows them to draw sentence level implicatures, things like scalar implicatures. So that's going, so the argument is we've gone from words to sentences, but we've taken a little bit of time to start figuring out what's going on there. And once we're confident, we can, for example, with scalars, let's take those with like all or some, then, and we're confident of how the question under discussion is marked, we can start to make these implicatures at the sentence level. And then the next step, when we're really confident with this level, it's not like these are completely separate, obviously they're cascading. We would now go to multi-sentential structures, so discourse and narrative, where children are starting to learn discourse markers like and, when, because, so, and they're really having to map a complex question under discussion hierarchy and local relations. And of course, what comes into play here is a very big tax on memory. So it's, you really don't see a lot going on here until about 3. But again, there's lots of evidence in narrative development for a highly Vygotskian process. So children are really socialized to produce the narratives that are standard for their community. And so caregivers, there are nice studies from Canada showing caregivers who ask a lot of what or where questions have children who systematically put those into their narrative from early on. How are we doing for time? Okay, I'm going to finish up by just talking about irony. Have I time to do that, or should I stop?
Well, I think if you could wrap it up, I think we'll have more time for questions. So,
okay, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just to wrap it up with one sentence about irony, which would be the pinnacle achievement here, that's a perfect example of how those prior stages are needed to postulate irony. So kids don't get irony, they don't get it, what it's doing for a long time. And the argument on this approach would be that you have to be very, very confident in what somebody has said, the current context, the fact that the speaker isn't mistaken, isn't trying to lie, and what's in common ground and what might be being echoed before you can start to posit that there even would be such a thing as irony that would perform a function of expressing an attitude. Sorry, that took me a little bit longer to get through that slide than I was expecting. I will wrap up here. This is just a resume of what we've discussed already, and the argument that these pragmatic developments are recreated at every level as more and more sophisticated tools become available and tested out in interaction. And of course, the conclusion is that we're geared towards interaction from the start, but we really need quite a lot of experience to gain a grasp of interaction and to become pragmatic again or Gricean again at different levels. Okay, sorry that took a little bit longer, that final slide. Thank you very much for listening, and to everybody on this slide for their collaboration, and I'd happily take questions or comments.
Thank you so much, and yeah, that was super exciting. I'm going to buy the book, so you already have one person.
Well, I'm very happy to share it for free, and I'd love comments. That's kind of the point of raising it today, was this audience obviously is one that I would very much welcome comments and corrections and suggestions from. So I will be happy to share the chapters and welcome feedback.
Yeah, perfect. So if you have questions, as always, put them in the chat. So a short version of your question. We'll again prioritize junior researchers. So put like a J or something in the chat. We'll also buy the book. More people buying the book, awesome. Maybe while we're waiting for questions in the chat, does anyone here have a question?
I think Larry asked a question about dental health.
Yeah, it's not an actual question. Yeah, I actually had a question about the information status stage, where the children have not yet mastered what sort of level in the vertical hierarchy to use. And I was wondering whether there's any evidence that this is correlated not so much with Gricean variables, but more kind of Stolnikarian, that it's really a question of presupposition and theory of mind. That a good example would be the non-adult use of demonstratives like he or that or it, where the child doesn't realize that the interlocutor is not a mind reader, and so will inappropriately use the wrong level to refer. Whether there's any evidence that this does correlate with other kinds of theory of mind development issues.
Yeah. So yeah, there's lots on that, and yeah, you're absolutely right. So so we could sort of chart social cognitive development up through different stages. So we could say that early on, children might understand belief. They might understand desires and attentional state, so people's intention and their attention, but not their beliefs. And right. So what you see is those aspects that can be of language or referential choice, if you like, that can be learned on the basis of these earlier emerging social cognitive developments are indeed learned earlier, and those ones that require more advanced belief and more advanced mental state understanding are indeed learned later. And some aspects of referential choice don't always really require mentalizing at all. So when you're choosing maybe whether to use a pronoun or not, according to the prior discourse, for example, there you don't really need to take somebody else's perspective at all, because the prior discourse is available to you also. So yeah, there's lots of evidence that basically what seems to happen is, in a non-linguistic domain, you seem to be able to see the social cognitive ability, and then a few months downstream, you see children being sensitive to it in their language use. But it is a two-way road. So language use promotes social cognitive development just as much as the other way around.
Thanks.
There's a question from Asya.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. And it was really interesting to hear that your intervention studies showed that this small daily intervention of 10 minutes produced such a strong result. That was, I would never expect that it could make such a big difference, but it's really interesting that it did. My question is about the long-term consequences of early advancement in vocabulary growth. So if you observe that an infant at 18 months has a larger vocabulary by 1 standard deviation, and given the model that you showed that there is a stage-like process when they acquire more and more sophisticated areas of pragmatics, do you expect this early vocabulary advantage to last and to show up on different levels, or do you think that they will compensate at some point and even out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So I should say with that intervention, actually, there was a very noticeable difference at 15 to 18 months, but because that was just a one-shot intervention, that didn't last until 24 months. So that's part of the answer there, I guess, is that just changing, because we didn't want to go in like too crazy. So this was just a short intervention, there was a big effect, but children tend to kind of almost revert to the trajectory would have predicted them to be on by a few months later, unless you continue intervening. So we're currently working with BBC Education to test whether if you provide parents with materials all the way through childhood, you do indeed get a vocabulary boost at school entry, and whether this has a knock-on effect. I mean, I think when it comes to other aspects of development, I guess you need a certain amount, it does seem you need a certain amount of vocabulary to take the next step. And there are interesting studies of international adoption which suggest that is the case. But fundamentally, when you're learning maybe about information packaging or discourse, it's a different thing, isn't it? You know, so you will need a certain vocabulary, but you're also going to have to tune in to a different level of structure, if you like. So I think I would say, generally speaking, children who have a larger vocabulary earlier on tend to just be linguistically able in general. And then when we did a systematic review of individual differences in pragmatic development, it was almost always the case that formal language skills, so tests of vocabulary and morphosyntax, were correlated with pragmatic abilities. Mm-hmm. It's not always a perfect correlation, but yeah, I think you do see relations, and children's vocabulary ability, certainly once they're in school, is extremely stable. So if you're on the 90th centile or the 25th centile at age 5, you're likely to be at the same centile later. So I think they kind of do go together.
Thank you.
Danielle, could you unshare the screen so that we see everyone? And then,
yeah, sorry.
Camilo has 2 questions. The first question is the same one I had, so you read my mind.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful talk. So the first question is, I guess, rather short. It's about the Donnellan 2020 paper, Donnellan et al. So you mentioned that the open face, open palm pointing had a detrimental effect. I think it was on word learning.
Yeah.
But how does the effect go in the other direction? So is finger pointing kind of a null baseline, or does it have an advantage?
It's more so. Index finger pointing, the more infants produce index finger points at 11 and 12 months, the larger their vocabulary is likely to be at 18 months. But the more they point with an open-handed point, the smaller their vocabulary is likely to be. And we think that's because this actually replicates a finding that was just on gesture from a German lab, Luca et al. And so this seems to be a marker of communicative immaturity. So the idea would be that the infant is motivated to communicate, but they don't perhaps have the motor means to do so in the typical fashion. So they're not maybe, so index finger pointing is predicted by two things: the age at which the baby has a pincer grip and their ability to follow other people's gaze. Those are the two best predictors of the onset of index finger pointing. So it might be that these babies have a motor delay. It might be a generic one, because these babies, it was also the case that babies who didn't produce consonants so much, so they vocalized a lot without consonants, that was vocalizing a lot without consonants was also a negative predictor. So it's not some kind of statistical baseline, I think you were asking in your question. No, it's actually, you do this more, that's a bad sign. Now, obviously, this is one snapshot in development at exactly a certain age. So it might well be you do this more earlier on, and that's an advantage, if you like. So this is just specifically at 11 and 12 months. But it looks like this is a sign that the baby's trying to communicate, but they're struggling actually, and they're likely then to struggle with producing words later on too.
Thank you. My second question is about figurative language.
Yeah.
So I think it was on your last slide, you had these 6 points, and the last one being figurative language. You mentioned, I don't know if you meant it, that these were kind of stages, and that the figurative language as a whole requires.
No, sorry. Yeah, it's really hard with figurative language to. Yeah. No, absolutely not. No. So obviously, I don't know whether you want to include humor as figurative, but humor obviously super early. Metaphor, depending on how you want to define it, but if we want like a strict definition of, using it to kind of highlight an attribute of something by reference to a source, then that's still quite early. I guess it's, for me, seems almost quite semantic in nature, but certainly irony is very late acquired, and metonymy perhaps somewhere in between the two. But irony seems to be a major challenge. So obviously the vast majority of the literature is on sarcasm understanding, so comprehension for children, and it so that what non-literal language was not supposed to be put at the end as a separate stage, but it is the case, I think, that irony is super late acquired, and it's one of the later acquired skills along with extended discourse and narrative, and I think there's a reasonable explanation of why that should be, which is that it requires second order theory of mind, and it requires really, really strong confidence, if you like, in how language is being used to then posit this admittedly quite strange thing to do with language, right? Whereas metaphor seems a lot easier.
Great, thanks.
Napoleon has a question.
Hey, thanks, Tanya. That was a great talk. And you're also trying to do something which I don't think many others are doing. I don't know others who are doing this, trying to map, the types of pragmatic development and look for mechanisms that might apply throughout development and across phenomena. I think that's extremely ambitious and extremely helpful. And immediately, I was then trying to think of, how can we disprove these claims that I find very, very, very likely. And at first I started thinking, okay, what happens with communities where the social interaction is very different? But to be honest, I don't know the data about these cases. So I thought, no, I'm not going to ask about that. I've not been to the Amazon or wherever I need to go. I thought of what happens. Let's see if we can challenge this idea that a principle of conventionality and contrast is so important, not only for learning word meanings, but also for understanding, the point of variation in word orders, information packaging, maybe, and this kind of thing. And I thought maybe bilingualism can tell us something, because we know that, in the beginning, children, I don't know what happens with the phonetics. Maybe with phonetics, it's very clear which language is being spoken, but we know in the beginning, the systems are not very differentiated. And we know that unless these children are very dominant and confident in one of the two languages, their ability to do this word learning by exclusion is limited. If they are trilingual, I think there's almost no reliance on word learning by exclusion. So wouldn't we expect, so let's take this case like trilingualism as a case where these children aren't very sure about what's conventional, and therefore they can't really infer that, this has departed from what I was expecting to be used, so it must mean something else.
Yes, Yeah, I completely understand your question, and it's a really good one. And so I do talk about this bilingualism literature at length in this chapter 3, which is about using words as conventions. So not just learning words, but learning that they are indeed conventions, which allows you to make these inferences. So this Byers Highline literature where bilingual, so for those who don't know, so if you have the test of the principle of convention of contrast, or what's often called the mutual exclusivity test, you have a known object, so say a pen or a cup. Well, there are different ways you can do this test, but one way is you have a known object and you have a novel object, and we just talked about that. And then if you ask for the MODI, I will infer that you must mean this novel object. But the idea is that this effect is attenuated or reduced in bilinguals, and it doesn't seem to be there at all in trilinguals. Now, that's in an experiment where who knows what, so yeah, that's true. But whether I very much, it's not like I don't think anybody would want to argue that bilinguals are not engaging in quite similar processes to learn words at all. It might be in this experimental setup they don't show it. I don't know. I think probably a lot is going on here in terms of the situation in which you're learning words, and I wouldn't be surprised in if everyday context children weren't using some kind of process like this just because they're not showing it in an experimental test, but I might be wrong. But it's certainly the case that the bilingual literature is kind of really confusing on this, because it should be the case, right, that you're able to tell, children know which language they're speaking, right? My son's bilingual, he totally knows whether he's speaking in French or English. And then these inferences should all be fine. There's not, so I think maybe with younger children, you don't see it to the same extent, but I would be surprised if some kind of reasoning to this extent will be completely impossible. I'm sure Eve Clark can expand on this because she's here. But it's certainly, if you look at the literature, just before I ask Eve's opinion, if you look at the literature from Gil Diesendruck on understanding words as conventions, it's really crazy. His stuff on Hebrew, English, bilinguals is just completely not straightforward at all. So I think you're absolutely right to ask the question of what's going on with bilinguals, but from what I've read of the literature, the answer is it's really not obvious. And my assumption would be actually something similar is probably going on. It's probably slightly different and possibly slightly slower to see the exact same effects, but probably perfectly functional for the bilingual. So that would be my not very clear answer. Eve, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think that it's both more complicated, and even when you take the monolingual case, what you find is that 1.5-year-olds are perfectly happy to learn that you can refer to the same object with 2 different terms, provided it's clear what the difference in meaning is between them. And so I think mutual exclusivity is a sort of complication in that it mischaracterizes what's going on. Children know that you can have a dog, but your dog might be a spaniel. And they know that at 18 to 24 months. They very often, when they're playing, for instance, I'll give you one example. We'll talk about something as being a wastepaper basket. Fine, but then they might pick one up and put it on their heads and call it a hat. Now, what they've done is reassign it to a different category, and therefore it can take a different label. Now, under mutual exclusivity, you would say you couldn't refer to that same object with 2 different labels, but of course children do it. And so I think that there you have to say, we have to look very carefully at what sort of meaning they've assigned to a word, and then how they're using this word for different kinds of objects. And the same then comes up with bilingual children, because they learn that one parent consistently speaks French, say, and the other consistently speaks English. So they're perfectly happy knowing that in this case, it's our dog, and in another case, it's c'est le chien. And they don't have any problem with that. Now, they don't necessarily use it very much themselves, but they certainly understand it. And from 18 months on, start to use it. And they will pick the appropriate language by parent. Lanza has some nice data on this, Elizabeth Lanza. But they will also, if they are cross with one parent or want something done that the parent is refusing to do, they will sometimes deliberately use the wrong language. So they are actually quite aware of the fact that they're dealing with two systems, or maybe Napoleon, in some cases, three systems. And they may start to use that in a very social way to get parents to attend, to manipulate things, to try to persuade someone. And you see this happening extremely early, certainly by age 2, in a whole lot of settings. So I think that the whole issue of how you label instances of categories is actually a rather complicated one when we start thinking about this. And you have to think about, what is the child trying to communicate? And so this is part of the social aspect of pragmatics. Of, is the child trying to communicate something about this particular instance or about this particular type? Or am I trying to pick this language because I want so-and-so to attend versus another person to attend? And there are a whole lot of dimensions. And when you add bilingualism, you add to those dimensions.
Thank you, Eve. That's much better than I could have done.
I don't think so.
And we can take one quick question from Diana.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the talk. I had a question about what you said at the beginning concerning the basis of communicative and informative intentions. I was wondering whether first you could clarify to us in which sense biobehavioral synchrony is linked to informative intention, if I understood correctly. And then more generally, if you could tell something about when do you think children start expressing and recognizing full-fledged communicative and informative intentions?
Yeah, so thank you. That's a lovely question. So I don't know if it's the case that, you know, there really is any link in its very early infancy between what I was talking about with emotions and informative intentions. But I think it's an interesting question to try and track back, right? Where could these things have come from? So I guess normally when people, well, I don't know, but when I hear people talking about informative and communicative intentions, like in a developmental context, you would be talking about, say, a child wants to direct your attention maybe to this map on the wall, and that's their informative intention, is like, look at the map. Their communicative intention is that you recognize that I'm trying to get you to look at the map, and maybe they have a broader social intention, is we use the map to plan our route because we wanted to plan our route or something. So, and then I guess the debate in the developmental literature would be whether those things are necessarily nested or whether they can run side to side. So in a Gricean way, one, you know, I intend that you intend to X and I want you to recognize that, or I want you to recognize that you're communicating with me and I want you to recognize that map, and they're sort of running in parallel. We did, Ed Donnellan, who did one of those studies, one of his studies for his PhD, which was pretty hard going. We tried to look for evidence that those two things are nested or not, and so we tried, you know, the literature on hidden authorship. So, like, you know, the whole copy, you know, show the glass at the party kind of literature. We were trying to come up with a way of testing that in children, and I've noticed that sometimes children, it turns out around 21 months, will pretend not to have heard you. I've got a video of this, actually, I can show if you're interested. But basically, if you say to a child, and we got them into the lab and would say things like, do you want a snack? And they'd be like, if they were playing with a game they enjoyed, they'd nonetheless stop it and come over and get their snack. But if they were playing the same game and you say, do you want to change nappy, with diaper in American, then they would just pretend they not heard you and go, and just not make eye contact. And we wanted to argue that that is similar in that it's deliberately not recognizing the having received the informative intention, but deliberately not recognizing the communicative intention in order not to have to engage with the informative and therefore the social intention. However, it's really hard to get that going in a lab, and we got evidence from questionnaires from parents that they thought their children were doing that, but the lab-based evidence was not so great. But what's going on earlier, I guess, is just trying to step back from these informative intentions. On the face of it, informative intentions are supposed to be about the outside world, right? But then they wouldn't be able to, then the argument would be they kind of came out of nowhere at 9 months of age. And I guess what I'm interested in is trying to chart the mechanisms where you get from one stage to the next. And it seems at least plausible that there is some continuity between what's going on at 6 months of age and what's going on at 9 and 12 months of age. And all that's going on at 6 months of age is really, well, maybe not 6, but certainly at 3 months of age, is the sharing of emotion. And I guess the point is that already communication is happening then. There are vocalizations, there are responses, and we know that babies are aligned with their caregivers in terms of their internal states. So I guess what I'm saying is it's plausible that that is the meaning of those vocalizations, if you like, is the affective state. And there's some evidence from Anne Fernald, I think, that children tune into language-specific affective cues from about 5 months. So it's just a possibility that there is some continuity there, but it would need to be tested. And I'm not exactly sure how you do that. But so I guess I'm putting it as a proposal. I don't know if you wanted to speak back to that or you had a comment on it, the plausibility of it.
Oh, thanks. I was really curious to hear, what you suggested about that, and I would be very interested if you have any material about the studies on the early development of hidden authorship, because the only one that I'm aware of is the Rosse and Tom Scott Phillips Modello study with 3-year-olds. So yeah, I need reference earlier.
It's a very high bar, isn't it? Hidden authorship is a very high bar. And I think ignoring is a lower bar, but it's quite hard to create artificially, annoyingly. So that's the trick.
Thanks.
Okay, so thank you everyone for the great discussion. Really exciting work. Thanks, Danielle, for presenting. And we'll see you again in about a month. We'll announce the speakers. Public
under negotiations.
It's still under negotiations, exactly. So have a great night and see you next month.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Danielle.